This is the final chapter in Children's Church that we started way back in September, with this year's theme being the family. And this year's theme of the family has illustrated the important place of women in our history of faith. Since September, leading up to this morning, we have been face to face with Eve, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Miriam, Rahab, Naomi, Ruth, Hannah, Bathsheba, Elizabeth, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Anna, Mary Magdalene of Easter morning, and today, Tabitha, a woman who did not personally meet Jesus, but whose life was transformed by Jesus. And I'd like to spend a moment as we close out this year-long study of the family to see how Tabitha might deepen our understanding, our faith, and transform our ministry that we share together. 3 things I'd like to highlight about her life as it may impact our lives. And the first is, I want to highlight her legacy. In the 36th verse, we read this. In Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name was Dorcas. Her life overflowed with, listen to this, good works and compassionate acts on behalf of those in need. Tabitha is the only female given the title as a disciple in Scripture. Now, you might think that this distinction of such a saintly title would be reserved for someone of prominence and power, prestige, and wealth. You might think the gifts of teaching or prophecy would serve as better disciple qualifications than merely sewing clothes for the needy. Not so. Because she was sewing for Jesus. She was sewing for Jesus. Following the example of Jesus by reaching out to the poor and those in need. One of my favorite passages, and if you're following along in the sermon outline, make sure you highlight this one. Make a note. Is the first chapter of James, verse 27a. It says this: religion, what we're doing here, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. Do I have your attention? So what the writer is saying is that religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. Now, before I share that, let me tell you what it's not. It's not what we're doing in the United Methodist Church right now. It's this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress. Think about that. That's the type of religion that God our Father sees as pure and faultless. Stephen Stiser says this, I'll quote him: true faith expresses itself in deeds, not words. You see, the legacy of Tabitha this morning begs us to ask, so what can I do? She sewed clothes for the widows and the orphans. What can I do? What lights my fire? What am I passionate about where I can channel my gift, my talent for Jesus? I ask that question, friends, because that's why we feed our community every Monday night. That's why 100 people come on a beautiful Saturday morning to pack 20,000 meals. Where even more than that will come back in November to pack another 100,000 meals. It's why we send 2 large trucks in December to Beverly, Kentucky the Redbird mission. It's why we have offering boxes at each of the exits, so that we can pay our fair share of shared ministries and partner with the United Methodists around the world. And yes, we are still doing phenomenal work. We are still, in the midst of our differences, doing wonderful ministry and mission domestically and globally. That's why we give, so that we can continue to make a difference. And it's why our upcoming VBS this year, its ministry, its mission, will deal with the local refugees in this area. How exciting! That's why we do what it is we do, so we, like Tabitha, can leave a legacy. But I want to also highlight, secondly, her loss. I continue in verse 37. About that time, though, she became ill that she died. After they washed her body, they laid her in an upstairs room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, when the disciples heard that Peter was there, they sent 2 people to Peter. They urged, "Please come right away." Peter went with them. Upon his arrival, he was taken to the upstairs room while the widow stood beside him, crying, as they showed the tunics and the other clothing Dorcas made when she was alive. Her passing must have been a sudden blow to this community. But they must have thought also that Peter could have helped. And they knew that he was in Lydda, only about 10 miles away. But if you get anything out of my message this morning, please get this. In that moment, when those 2 came to Peter 10 miles away, Peter shares the greatest God-given ability we can ever share. This is number 1. And it is not compatibility or accountability or reliability or adaptability. The greatest God-given ability we can ever share is availability. Peter made himself available. Because, friends, without availability, any kind of ability is useless. Without making ourselves available, our gifts are void. In her death, we sense, or at least I sensed in my study this week, that Tabitha was really irreplaceable. But the lesson for us, however, is not to confuse irreplaceable with being indispensable. Let me take a moment on this, because they are not the same. She was one of a kind. But guess what? So are you. Some of you are going, oh no. You are one of a kind. No one ever has or ever will be created like you. Tabitha was one of a kind. She had a wonderful talent. However, our role as a church, our motivation, is to understand that we might be irreplaceable because we're different, but we're never indispensable. Because our motivation as Christians is to make, to produce and reproduce disciples, to duplicate ourselves. My guiding passage in Bible and ministry since day one is Ephesians 4:12. That the role of the pastor, the role of the teacher, is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. That is what my job description is. To equip the saints for the work of ministry. But I never read this before. I went to the Message translation and read that verse. I just want to read it to you. It's beautiful. The pastor is to train Christ's followers in skilled servant work, working within Christ's body, the church, until we're all moving rhythmically and easily with each other. Efficient and graceful in response to God's Son. Fully mature adults, fully developed within and without, fully alive like Christ. I love that. In that light, we must understand that none of us should be indispensable. None of us. Oh, indeed, irreplaceable because we're different, but not indispensable. Let me get very local for a moment. This means that if we are more dependent this year on fill in the person's name. Okay, I will. Dave, Rosemarie, Donna, Carolyn, Lynn. If we are more dependent on them this year than we were last year, then friends, we are not following Jesus. We're cheerleading. And I don't see cheerleading in Holy Scripture as the role of a disciple. Yes, we should value one another, but not operate in a vacuum where any one person becomes the lifeblood of the ministry. Where the emphasis is squarely on duplication and not on individual reliance. Oh, the community was sad when Tabitha died, but the sowing didn't stop. It continued. She leaves a legacy. Her loss forced the community to band together to continue the ministry. But finally, in this passage, we learn about her Lord. I conclude in verse 40. Peter sent everyone out of the room, then knelt and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up!" She opened her eyes, saw Peter, and sat up. He gave her his hand and raised her up. Then he called God's holy people, including the widows, and presented her alive to them. The news spread throughout Joppa, and many put their faith in the Lord. See, Peter was only doing what he saw Jesus do in Mark 5 with the young girl. Sent everybody out, raised her. Even the gospel writer Luke in chapter 6, verse 40 says, everyone who was fully trained will be like their teacher. That's what Peter was doing. He was trained by Jesus. He did what Jesus did. And like Jesus, Peter raises Tabitha into life, one of the only 7 people recorded in Scripture raised from death, and the only adult woman. But don't miss the effect. Tabitha's death brought renewed faith. The life, death, and resurrection of Tabitha helps bring the good news of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Scripture says this news spread, and many put their faith in the Lord. I end this. So what's in your hand this morning? For Moses long ago, it was a staff, where God instructed him to use that staff and be his servant. For Tabitha, it was a needle and thread as her instrument to serve God. What's in mine? What's in yours? What's in ours collectively? What gift, talent, passion rests in our hands that we need to make available for Jesus? Because my takeaway this morning and this week is that it is very human to possess a gift, but it only becomes divine when the gift blesses others, when it overflows onto those in need. Thank you, Tabitha, for that reminder. Let us pray. Holy and wonderful God, you have made us so unique, wonderful, so that all we do with the gifts you have given us might glorify you, might build this kingdom on earth as it already is in heaven. May we learn from our sister this morning that each of us has a legacy to leave. that each of us may be irreplaceable but not indispensable, and that each of us is called to spread the news of your love and to put faith in the hearts of our brothers and sisters. May it be so. In your name we pray. Amen.